Chris, we ready to go? Are you ready to go? I guess I should say.
I am now ready to go.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is the Board of Selectmen meeting for March 9, 2021. And pursuant to the Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting of the Medfield Select Board is being conducted via remote participation. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings as provided for in the order. A reminder that persons who would like to listen or view this meeting while in progress may do so by following the instructions on the agenda and the meeting notice. All votes subject to remote participation and therefore will be roll call votes. Select Board members Michael Marcucci, Gustav Murby, and Osler Peterson are participating, as is, I see, Town Administrator Christine Troreiler, Assistant Town Administrator Nicholas Milano. Our condolences to you, Nick, for your loss this week, and Town Council Mark Sorrell. We always start by taking a moment of appreciation for the troops of the United States of America that are serving around the globe. So why don't we do that right now? Thank you. I don't know why, but I always imagine Afghanistan when we're doing that. Although most of them are probably in Germany and Korea, aren't they, Gus?
Well, there's still some in Afghanistan. It'd be kind of nice to see them get a heck out of there.
Yeah, but don't we have many more in Korea and Germany than?
Oh, yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Our first appointment is Charlie Harris to request permission to hold the Medfield Car Show on June 27, 2021, COVID permitting.
So I just briefly spoke to Charlie, and he's not going to be able to attend the meeting. So if I may speak for him, he is requesting to hold the Medfield Car Show on June 27th. As you know, we weren't allowed to have it last year. I spoke with Bridget Sweet from the Board of Health today, and she had no issue if the Board of Selectmen so inclined to do a conditional approval, if in fact this will be allowed on June 27th. We should have additional updates and guidance for these sorts of gatherings after March 22nd. So we'll have a little more information after that. Charlie is aware that you may approve this and he can start advertising, but he may actually not be able to go forward with it. And he is okay with that, if you are as well.
And just confirming, this is June 27th is Sunday. I'm mindful of all the other commitments we made, but I think all the other commitments were for Saturdays.
I did not have anything on June 27th, and neither did John Thompson.
Okay.
There isn't much opportunity for questions. So
No, but I think we all are familiar with Charlie's
Yes.
presentation on this. So I would move that we authorize Mr. Harris to hold the Medfield Car Show on June 27th, 2021 at the State Hospital, subject to all applicable health regulations at that time.
Second.
Mr. Peterson,
yes,
Mr. Murby,
Yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
I found that with the last one that I went to, it was like going down memory lane. There were about a dozen former cars that I had owned that I saw there. Second appointment is with Russ Hallisey to present plans for New Life Trail Run at the Medfield State Hospital on May 8, 2021.
Let me promote Russ and Tristan. Hold on one second.
And they apparently have already, or they've asked the Commonwealth for permission to use the Commonwealth's land. Hello, Tristan. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. How's New Life
It's
doing?
It's great. They've worked really, really hard to stay open and to find creative ways to continue to serve all of the people who really depend on their services. So a lot of it's online. A lot of our volunteers were not, comfortable even coming in just by themselves to work in the warehouse. So they've done a great job of really finding creative solutions to keep serving people.
Oh,
And
good.
yeah, really, it's going great. So we're eager for COVID to be behind us, where we can really get back into that warehouse and do the work we love to do. So
Yep.
thank you for
Yep.
asking. Yeah.
So I don't see Russ on my screen. Is he coming?
Yeah, he's
He's
there.
here. Yep.
Oh, I just don't have a wide enough view. Okay, who's going to present? Russ, are you going to go ahead?
I'll just
Thank you for
start it
coming,
off.
Russ.
I'll just start it off and then Tristan will continue in bulk. But as the prior requester, we're looking for a conditional approval as well. We were calling it a provisional, but conditional, provisional, whichever you prefer, in doing our fourth trail run at the state hospital. Understanding, of course, with COVID, we can't get full approval. And last year, we had to have a totally virtual run, which was successful. But this year, we're hoping that it will open up so that we can do a live event and do virtual as well, with the fallback that it may be totally virtual again. And reminding you, I know you all know about New Life, started in 2013 and opened up like gangbusters and is doing tremendous. So with that, a little bit of an introduction on what we're looking for tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Tristan and she can explain a little bit more and then field any of your questions.
Thank you, Russ. I think what we were encouraged when the Commonwealth decided to announce plans to move into phase 4, starting March 22nd. And I realized that they haven't opened up or decided to move into the stage yet that would include road races. Although I think, like everybody, we're starting to get optimistic that some of the things that we've really been missing might become possible here in the near future. So I think what we would love the opportunity to do is to plan for the possibility of an in-person race if, of course, the Commonwealth opens phase 4 and expands it further to include road races. And so we would seek a conditional approval from you in the event that does occur. We've worked together to come up with some creative measures that I think would ensure the safety of not only our participants, but also our volunteers that would be on hand for an in-person event that day. And obviously we would remain totally flexible about that, depending on what the state regulations said and depending on what the Medfield Board of Selectmen said or what the Medfield Board of Health would require of us. We'd be happy to work with all of you and cooperate if there are additional measures that we haven't thought of that you would like us to put into place. Just briefly to highlight a few of the things that we have come up with, we would basically have a very bare bones, stripped down in-person event. And frankly, I think because a lot of participants enjoyed the virtual event last year, we anticipate that a large number of our participants might still continue to participate that way this year. So we aren't dealing with 1,000 people trying to do an in-person event. It would probably be closer to about 150 people at most, I would think. And what we propose to do is have people register in advance. They would register for a specific time when they would show up to begin the 5K. Everyone who participated in person we would have staggered start times. So only 10 people at a time would be starting on the race course, separated by 5-minute intervals. So 10 people would start, we'd wait 5 minutes, another 10 people would start, and that would prevent a lot of overlap on the race course and certainly overlap at the start line that you might see in a traditional event where people are all crowded together waiting to start. We would, of course, require everyone, volunteers and participants, to be masked at all times, to keep social distance from one another, where there should be plenty of room to do that on the race course and all over the grounds that we would occupy there. We would have signage up reminding people to follow those rules. We would not offer any in-day registration. All registration would have to be in advance, which would cut down the amount of contact that volunteers would have with participants that day. We have eliminated all social activities, no food and drink will be provided. We won't be handing out any items, any swag or t-shirts of any kind. We'll deliver that to people's homes or send it to people's homes separately. We will have no water stations on the race course, and we will have hand sanitizer available. And I think the only other thing to mention is that because we would have people register in advance and show up at a particular time, we would have very careful and complete records of when people were in person there, so that in the event that we later found out a participant contracted COVID, we would be able to go back and do very efficient and thorough contact tracing for anybody who might have overlapped with that person in a small group. So those are a few of the things that we came up with. And, we recognize it may be a long shot for phase 4 to expand to include road races by May 8th, but in the event that they do, we'd love to be able to have your conditional approval and be ready to go to offer that to people. I think they'd really enjoy it if it was a safe option.
Okay, thank you. Gus, do you want to start off? You need to unmute. Gus was doing so well in our executive session running it, but
yeah, it's so much easier to leave it off mute. I mean, none of us know what the requirements are going to be as we get through to May, and they could just as easily be more relaxed as they could be rigorous.
Yep.
Will you be in touch with the Board of Health? It seems to me it would make sense to get the Board of Health's recommendations, and maybe even to stay in touch with the Board of Health to make sure that the recommendations are as up to date as they could be, so that you don't have to do more than you have to do, but you do things that are required.
Yeah, we would be happy to be in a total cooperation with them, work hand in glove with them, and comply with anything they asked us to do.
Okay. In the courses, if you've already sent it to us, I apologize for not having seen, because I think there was a description I don't think I've seen yet that I think I might have seen come in. But is the course is it like the cross country course, or is it on the road, or is it where is it actually going?
A little of both. It works its way. It starts at one point on the state hospital grounds. It works its way across some of the Charles River conservation land, and we have applied for they require an application for use of that land, which we apply for every year. We've always been approved for it. We haven't heard back from them yet, and I suspect that's because phase 4 for road races hasn't been put in place, but we'll be in touch with them and get that approval.
Okay. As much as anything, I was curious about whether there's runners on roads or runners crossing roads.
No, it stays on the hospital grounds, goes through the trail run, and then loops back down around to the same spot where it starts at on the hospital grounds. And we did get the approval from the Medfield State Hospital to use the property that day as well. That's that's ready to go.
Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I had the same reaction as Gus. I think our approval should just be conditional on compliance with whatever the health regulations are at the time. I think you've outlined a very thoughtful and thorough set of guidelines for doing this safely. I'm hopeful you won't have to do all of those things come May. So I think we should approve it just conditional on compliance with state and town health guidance in effect at the time.
So I agree with those concepts. I also have been trying to get the town to adopt a checklist for these types of requests, but we haven't adopted that yet. Somebody like Memo for Medfield Day has a voluminous checklist for the things that they do with the town. And I've been suggesting that the select board should adopt a similar checklist for events that we permit, but we haven't created it yet, Tristan. So
we're happy to follow whatever guidance you put forward between now and May And we're keeping our fingers crossed that the Commonwealth comes through, but
Absolutely.
we will of course be in full cooperation with Medfield.
Yeah, good luck with getting your ability to go forward with it.
Yeah.
Hope it works out for you.
Thank you.
Might I suggest that we be in contact with Christine along the way, just letting her know what approvals we've received, what we've heard from the Board of Health, and just
Absolutely.
having her be your point person
Sure.
She
between us.
is, yep.
Yep.
Yep,
I think
please.
Is that okay with you, Christine?
That's fine. Actually, I was going to say that I talked to the Board of Health agent today on your behalf, and she was fine with it if the Board of Selectmen would issue a conditional approval. She would just like to work with you on COVID protocols. As these events happen, they're just going to keep a copy of the protocols in the office downstairs. But I think she's worked with you on the event prior, so she said she had no issue with it.
Great. Thank you. That's terrific. Yep.
I will. Bill Massaro just posted a comment in the chat, and I should have thought about this earlier. We may need to work on the route. There is going to be some work done at the state hospital in the back and the laundry parcel. So I need to look at your map and see if you may have to do some slight adjustments.
Okay.
We can look at that as we get closer.
Sure.
All right, well, then I would move that we approve the request to have the New Life Trail Run at the Medfield State Hospital on May 8th, 2021, subject to compliance with all applicable state and local health guidelines and regulations.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes. Thank you both.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Good
We
luck with
thank
it.
the board, and we thank Christine for all of the assistance she's providing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Our next agenda item is under discussion title, potential votes, COVID-19 status update and CARES funding update. Anything, Chris?
No, we're still waiting to hear how the new stimulus money will be distributed to cities and towns. So we hopefully will have an update and a plan for that in the next few weeks.
Okay.
We're all anxious to see how this is going to work and how it will impact our budget. So we'll have that for you hopefully by the next meeting, if not the following one.
Yep. And then the next is the fiscal 2022 operating and capital budgets and financial policies. And I guess, Gus, you've got some material you wanted to present to us. Chris,
Sure.
do you have anything you wanted to present first, or?
No,
we just-
Gus is going to
okay.
present tonight.
Yeah, just walk down. It probably will make sense to put this up on the screen for people to see and I can do it from my end, or if you guys have it and want to bring it up, you can.
Do we have it? Did you send it to us, Gus?
Yeah.
It was emailed this afternoon.
Email.
Oh,
Yep.
I've got to go check my other email. Hold on.
Okay. Well, at this point, you
I have
can
it. Do you want me to forward it to your work email?
Yes, thank you.
so Nick, you want to bring it up, or you want me to share my screen?
Sure, just give me 1 second.
Okay. While Nick is doing that, for any of the people here tuned into the meeting, a couple of years ago, I had started to use a method to take a look at the budget, the town budget going into the town meeting each year. The idea was introduced to me initially as an example of how the town of Weymouth managed their budget, and I subsequently learned that this methodology is referred to as the Lexington model. So apparently at some point in time, the town of Lexington adopted this approach for analyzing the budget. The basic idea behind this is that you take a look to start with at the general revenues that are coming in, so you know how much money is coming in. The purpose of the tool is to at least provide a view of where the town budget stands relative to Prop 2.5 limits. And what it does in all of these cases, but certainly in the case of Medfield, is to pull out what I would call the non-discretionary spending elements and take them out up top, so that what you have is the revenues that are left for the town then get split between town departments and the school department. So I'm going to walk through this and kind of highlight it, but maybe before we do it, I just want to explain where it's headed. At the bottom of this spreadsheet, what we have are two columns, one which is the town department budget, the other is the school department budget. And the way this has worked, a couple of years ago when I first started doing this, I did a review of 10 years of town budgets, and using this analytical method, to my surprise, even though every year, including the 6 years I was on the warrant committee, we went through a completely different process with a different set of discussions. At the end, in looking at those 10 years, I discovered that the town had consistently allocated 25% of its revenue available for operating budgets to the town budgets and 75% to the town. So this model is
75% to the schools, Gus.
70, what did I just say? 25% to town budget, town department, 75% to the school department. Thank you, Pete. And so what this basically does is lay out what that looks like for purposes of figuring out where you probably have to look at cutting budgets if we're going to stay within Prop 2.5 limits. So just very briefly, and certainly with Nick, Yvonne, and George's help and Christine's help, we have, as far as I can tell, the most up-to-date information around revenues and budgets as of what effectively would be today. So let me just quickly walk down this. If you take a look at tax revenues, it's pretty straightforward. Take a look at the FY21 tax levy, what we actually charged last year. You're allowed to increase that tax levy by 2.5%, which is the second line there around how much the Prop 2.5 would allow us to increase our tax levy. You add in new growth, and then on top of that, all of the debt exclusions that get passed over the years, those here get added in as allowable spending. And then as we go farther down, underneath that, we have operating overrides and things like that. I'm not going to go through all of the items here, but at the very bottom, you can see that the total available general revenues here on line 37 is just under $70 million, $69.6 million. So this is the money that we have actually coming into the town to include the allowable increase in Prop 2.5 allowed increase in spending for FY22. You go back down to the next section there, Nick. So section 1 here is fixed expenditures. These are basically things we don't have any choice about spending money on. And if anybody has questions, you can ask the questions, but basically these are all in here as fixed expenditures that we have to spend money on. Section 2 are employee benefits, and to include insurance, but also pension. OPEB appropriation shows up in here. And again, these are basically costs to the town that we don't have a whole lot of control over. And section 3 is debt service. So this is debt, principal and interest paid on the outstanding debt in town. The next section down, section 4, is capital spending. Now, you could make the case that some of these things are more discretionary, but I think one of the things that we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is to change our budgeting discipline away from what probably had been the case in years past, which was we'd go through and create all the operating budgets and all the other expenditures, and then if we could scrape money together to cover capital expenses, then that was a good year, and that's what we would do. What we realized a few years ago, and as far as I think Mike Marcucci deserves the lead credit for pushing ideas to put in longer term financial discipline around things like anticipating and planning for our capital investments and our capital maintenance. This is basically, we're putting all of those capital expenditures farther forward in the process rather than at the tail end of the process. That makes for pain at the tail end, but it's certainly a more responsible way to manage our long-term expenses around capital. And then because there are articles that are proposed for our town meeting, some of which have financial implications, we basically carry in section 5 here estimates of what the financial implications of identified articles for our upcoming town meeting in May are, and basically we make provisions for them in section 5 here. So you can go on down below that, Nick. When we get, once we get all that, now we're into operating budget territory. And at this point, this spreadsheet splits into 2 columns. recognizing that we do in fact get state aid in the form of general state aid, which goes to the town, and Chapter 70 funds, which go to the schools, we take the allocated revenues, and for a second here, if you look at line 93, allocated general revenues, what that line is doing is taking the percentages that you see down on line 106, and it's distributing the total revenue that was available once we took all those other expenses off the revenue to the town. It allocates it. So in essence, what this is saying is after we've paid for all those other things in our budget, the town has allocated general revenues of $10.5 million. The school has allocated general revenues of $31.5 million. We add $1.7 million in state aid to the town budget, allocated revenues, and $6.4 million in Chapter 70 funds to the allocated revenues to the schools. And that then gives us the total revenues available to the town and schools on line 107. The town has about $12.5 million that it can spend, and the schools have $37.7 million that they can spend. One point last year that came out of this, for anyone who's wondering about Chapter 90 funds, Chapter 90 funds kind of come directly into the town. They don't show up on our budget. So if you were wondering where did Chapter 90 go, that's not actually carried in this budget here. When you then take that revenue split, it gets sort of simple. On the town side, we have the total town operating budget. On the school side, we have the vocational school allocation to Medfield, and we have the school operating budget as it's proposed. So these are both proposed numbers. If you go down a little bit farther, you'll see basically what we're doing. That's good, Nick. Thank you. What we're doing is we're taking on the town side the number on line 116, which is the same as the line above it, subtracting that from the allocated revenues of $12.5 million. And what that is saying on line 117 is that the town is maintaining its budget below that allocated split of 25%. And basically is not planning to use $422,453. On the school side, you can see that the school budget of $38,348,229 actually results in an $843,000 overage on the allocated revenues for the schools. And again, remember, this is all keeping us within the Prop 2.5 limits. What happens on this spreadsheet then is that we are taking the $422,453 that is not being used on the town side and basically handing it over to offset the shortfall on the school side, which leaves a remaining $420,562 as the identified cut on the school side that needs to be made if we're going to avoid an override. If we're not going to avoid an override, then that's the amount of the override that would be required. And that's pretty much the split. What it basically does is it holds a certain amount of discipline around the growth on both sides of our budget. So when we're trying to figure out what is it we need to do overall, this is sort of drawing a line in the sand based on the 25-75 historic split on where the pressure is to cut, and in this case, where relief came from on the town side. Any questions? I would comment, I know that I think there's at least one or two warrant committee members here. I think the warrant committee has been aware of this. This has been my score sheet for some time now. Up till now, the warrant committee has not adopted this as a formal tool that it wants to use. I don't know whether you'll change your mind this year, but at least this is the view of the budget and where we stand and where we need to go with it.
Mike, did you have any questions or comments?
I do. I'm still trying to look through the sheet. Obviously, we've gone over this before.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You just got it, didn't you?
So I'm familiar with, yeah, I've been unable to look at stuff before this. And I guess the first question I would ask us is sort of, what is the conclusion or the action step or the direction in which you think this ought to take us as we prepare the budget for town meeting?
So in my view, a couple things. One, last year, the town operating budget was reduced to go backwards 2 fiscal years. So a chief concern that I've had when we shortchange our town operations on a sustained basis, what we're doing is we're basically putting ourselves in a position where we really need to take a look at programmatic decisions around what town services are provided if we're just changing on a permanent basis. Now, last year, I understand why the town did what it did, because in essence, we had an uncertain threat. We didn't really know what the financial ramifications were going to be. And as a town, we made the decision to do what we could to protect the schools so that if there was going to be damage or done to the town in general, that damage would be done on the town side. This year, my view is that the town should be recovering that, or we should be making a decision that there's something that we cut last year that really was superfluous. And we should be working to restore the town budget to as close to whole as we could. Christine, I think to her credit, did not just jump on that and try to undo everything, but I think is trying to bring the town back on a more gradual glide path to a more reasonable distribution between the two budgets. So for me, the implication here is that the town has helped with a significant overage in growth on the school side. And I say that not to throw a rock at the schools. The school budget went up 1.1% last year, but from a Prop 2.5 standpoint, that created an $800,000 overage relative to Prop 2.5 limit here, the way I've allocated it. And the town is still going to be able to pick up part of that. So as I would look at it, the implication is the schools have to figure out how to take 420,000 out, or we have to decide that we're going to go into town meeting asking for an operating override.
I guess what I'm struggling with a little bit, because I think you're not actually proposing any more spending on the town side. I mean,
No.
And so if the theory is that we should be trying to recover, in your view, which, as we've discussed in the past, I don't necessarily agree with the normative aspect. I agree with the analytical value of this approach. I don't agree with the normative aspect of it. But if you're not proposing to spend extra money on the town budgets, and believe me, I'm not either. What's the restoration that you're achieving by this approach?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question was that you asked there. Let me restate what you said.
Well,
I'm not proposing to increase town spending, because the town administrator has not proposed to increase town spending. So I'm taking the town administrator's recommendation here that says there's 422,000 available relative to the historic split of this revenue over the past probably 15 fiscal years now. And the town is not proposing to apply that to its budgets. Therefore, I'm saying, so of that $800,000 shortfall that we're dealing with overall, I'm fine with us taking that 422 that the town doesn't need in its budgets. And I'm not saying that meaning they wouldn't like it. I'm just saying they're saying we can get by doing this, that we apply that to the shortfall, and that leaves us with a $420,000 shortfall that either the schools have to find a way to take that out of their budget, or we need to recognize we're going to be looking at an override.
Okay, so it's not as though you've
or we could make other decisions around reserve fund contributions like we have sometimes done in the past. But I'm with you on that, that's not a good idea, given our current reserve status.
right. I mean, I think, I mean, from the reserve standpoint, I mean, the budget as it currently stands complies with our financial policies and makes up some of our historical deficit in
Mhm.
both capital and reserves without an override. And I think the number is correct. The overall number for the budget, that the problem we have to solve for next year is about 420. But the challenge I have with this is sort of a normative method, is that you're sort of artificially allocating money to the town side when we don't need it, right? And it's not, I don't think it's a matter of getting by in the budgets. I think we're going to be able to agree to new collective bargaining agreements with both the police and the fire, and that will provide, you know, adequate compensation as agreed with them for next year. We'll be able to provide raises to town employees who didn't get them this year. There won't be any cuts or reductions in services. I mean, I think that it's not a matter of I agree, last year we cut it back, right? We took a 5% cut, schools went up by 1%. I think that was a responsible approach to last year's budget. But I guess if we're not seeing kind of money that we need to spend, if there's not some service that is necessary for the town that we're not providing, then I don't quite get the.
Well, so let me respond to, let me make 2 points. One, in thinking about this big picture, the other thing I think we shouldn't ignore is the relief bill that appears to be on the verge of passage, a significant portion of which has aid targeted for schools, education, and actually local government. So in the same way that last year, for this fiscal year, we went through a drill and took actions to include compromising on our fiscal policies. And then by the end of the year, we had $600-some thousand come in by way of aid. I think we need to look at this 420 in that context, recognizing there's a second bill. So that'd be the first point. Second, the more important one, or the more direct response to your point, though, Mike, is what I said I've done is I looked at the time that I did it, like 3 years ago, I looked at 10 fiscal years, and I discovered that the town and the schools have historically split the revenues 25%, 75%. I didn't start with that. That's what the history said. So that to me was a pretty clear bellwether of how the town has chosen to balance town services and school services. There was, I think, 1 year in there where the town was 24% and the schools were 76%. This year, I could monkey with those two numbers on the spreadsheet, turn them to 24% and 76%. And basically that $420,000 that's on the town side flips over. And then we still have the problem. But then we've, at the split side, we've said instead of 25-75, it's 24-76. So that, just so you know how close we still are to that split. What you're saying is this particular year, if the town can afford to hand over $420,000, I think whether you intended to ask the question, you're saying, are we in fact overemphasizing the town on an ongoing basis by basically making close to $500,000 too much available to the town? I don't think that's
the other way around, right?
Well, no, with the 25-75 split, if the town has 420,000 excess that it can hand over to the school side, if I understood where you were driving your comment, what you're saying is the normative problem you've over allocated by giving the town 25%. You've just picked a number that's too high. And I'm saying I don't think so. Historically, there have been years where there's been a 1% switch. But if we decided that was true, then what I would do is say, then change the norm to 24%, 76%, and then we'll live with that. What I'm really, you want to know what I'm really saying, Mike, is we as a town have a decision to make, which is, will we as a town live are we committed to living within Prop 2.5 limits? Or are we committed to just basically accepting overrides every couple of years? And we really have no intention of living within Prop 2.5 limits. What I think is a mistake to say we're living within Prop 2.5 limits. And then if the school department can't do that or won't do that, then the town has to keep reducing itself. And if we're going to do that, then we have to cut over time, we have to cut town services. So I'm trying to drive a disciplined discussion, not trying to dictate an answer, but I am trying to drive a disciplined discussion around, are we serious about Prop 2.5? Or are we not serious about Prop 2.5? Because that has implications for people who live here in terms of what in the long run they're going to be able to afford.
Yeah, no, and you know, and that's why I think it's a useful analytical tool and not necessarily a normative tool, right? Because that 75-25 split kind of emerged in sort of, you know, spontaneous order, right? There was no intention at the outset to divide the money that way. And I think what you describe as a town that have overrides every year well describes the town of Medfield between 2000 and 2010. Right, between 2000 and 2010, I think there were overrides in 8 of 10 years.
But so this was more
driven by what was then sort of the historic run up in school enrollment, which peaked in 2008 and has been declining since then.
Mm-hmm.
But in the last 11 years, we've only had 2 operating overrides. I mean, so
no, fair enough. What I'm really saying, I think the time frame that I analyzed this was FY09 to FY18.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the 10 years, just so you know. What I'm saying is I analyzed it. I wasn't expecting these numbers. I was expecting 1/3, 2/3.
Mm-hmm.
I analyzed it and I view those 10 years as being a reasonably good picture of how the town has chosen consistently to balance town services against school educational services. So, and this is really only intended as that kind of a stake in the ground. Let's say it's not normative in terms of there's no superior cosmic insight here. This is who we've been. This is how we balance things. And it's really intended to drive this conversation we're having. If we want to consciously make a change, we can do that. That will have implications. If we want to say that's a really interesting spreadsheet, but we don't care, we'll just run overrides like we did from 2000 to 2010. That's a statement, and that tells people something, assuming that the taxpayers go along with it. I'm at this stage of the game where we know that we're short of the Prop 2.5 limit, and we know that the town needs to do something about it. This spreadsheet is intended to be at least a somewhat impartial picture of who needs to do what.
Sure, no, I appreciate that, but I think that kind of with any spending decision, you also have to focus what you're spending the money on, right? I mean, I don't think you're suggesting just putting money into budgets because we could, according to this rubric. And obviously, as you noted, kind of my priority in all of this is adherence to the capital and the reserves policies, which affect the whole town. Which I'm optimistic that this is a year we'll be able to do it. And I think that you've also hit upon what may be the solution here, which is that there's going to be additional federal money coming in that will not require an override and may not require any cuts on the school side either.
Except that it won't go in this approved budget because we don't have the federal money. So
no, we may know it's coming and be able to allocate that as expected revenue against this budget. I mean, I suspect if the bill passes in the next week, I mean, I think the bill that passed in December, I think we had our number within a few days. So I suspect that it's going to be run through a formula, and that formula is going to work its way down to Medfield. So I think by town meeting, we will know what that number is and how much that will affect what we're doing here. So
I guess I'd make a couple points, Mike. I'm accepting the town administrator's budget as it was submitted. I'm accepting the school committee's budget as it's submitted. And this is a picture that so far one selectman, me, has used to keep my own internal score sheet going. And I think every year I've offered the information to the warrant committee to consider, ignore, take part of, use however they see fit, because I also think, and certainly as one selectman, I think all three of us, we look to the warrant committee to come in with their view of what they think is the right thing for the town to do. And I'm prepared to, listen to the warrant committee's view on that as well. So,
No, and I appreciate you putting this together. I
Yeah.
know there's a lot of work that goes into this.
yeah, Nick's
into
doing
the
most of it now.
spreadsheet.
It used to
Yeah.
be a lot of work. Now I just sit there and send Nick what I've got and ask him if he can clean it up for me. So it's
Well,
getting easier.
Thank you to Nick. And I do think the allocation of the budgets into different buckets makes a good bit of sense. I could probably quibble with a few of them, but I think it makes more sense than kind of our traditional sheet that just kind of lumps everything in the budget together, when some of these are not, they're not all exactly the same, right? And I think it's helpful to put things in different categories, basically ranked by how much control over we have.
Right.
How much control we
Yeah.
have over being able to spend it or not. Like, we don't have an option to not pay the principal and interest on our debt. So it's not really
Right.
the same thing as some other kind of spending.
Right.
So
Incidentally, and then that section 5, which has the articles. I don't know that any monetary articles have been eliminated yet, but to the extent that there have been times when an article that showed up early in the process as an extra, as a financial article for the town warrant, by the time we got to the town meeting, it got withdrawn. So there have been times when we've gotten some windfalls that way as well. So food for thought.
thank you, Gus.
I found it an interesting exercise, Gus, so thank you for doing it. And I guess it all flows from that assumption of the 25-75 split. But and if that is the right split, then it gets you down to an answer of who owns the need to balance the budget, basically.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so with this, it looks like it belongs to the schools, but the town doesn't have to go along with that either. So the warrant committee will come up with some solutions, I'm sure.
Yeah, when I was on the warrant committee, and Mike, when you were there, Mike Sullivan used to struggle with this, and part of the problem was the way we used to budget was there was a school budget, and then there was everything else that was the town. And if you think about it, to the extent that the costs that I have at the top of this sheet, like the healthcare costs, pension costs, some things like that, are not costs the town can control. Basically, all of that variability was being put on the shoulders of the town administrator to manage, but the town administrator only had control over the town operating budget. And so a lot of the struggles that we had to do with the fact that the town, under the town side of the budget, had absorbed all of the non-controllable variable expenses. And the way we did it was to move the capital expending to the bottom of the heap. So rather than sacrifice the operating budgets, we sacrificed the capital budgets. By moving these things farther toward the top, so there's pure operating budgets at the bottom, and then there's all the other stuff that's sort of driven either by non-discretionary spending or firm town policy type decisions. Those things get taken out first. In the way I usually describe it, that says, so then the mouse under the rug can't run anywhere it wants in the room. We've tacked down most of the room. The mouse under the rug is kind of boxed into the one corner of the budget that's called the operating budgets. So that's where we push the pain. Deliberately, and probably wisely.
Anything more then on this?
Not if there's no questions.
Thanks, Gus.
Okay,
You're
thank you.
welcome.
Annual town meeting and warrant articles. Chris, anything on that tonight?
I have one thing. I would like to just draw your attention to the economic vitality article. I think we're going to need to have a conversation about if we're going to move forward with this at the full amount of the 15,000. It did come up at the warrant committee last night. So I think the selectmen need to consider if we're going to ask for the full 15,000 or if we're going to come back on that this year.
Chris, do we have a balance I thought we used up a lot of it this year, but what's the balance?
Well, so we used up a lot of it, but then we were able to submit it through CARES.
Okay.
So as of right now, we have a balance around $20,000. Now we're expecting to use a lot of that this year because we'll have the holiday stroll. We should have some more outdoor activities. So we, should see us use more of that as we go forward.
And plus, Jean Minio is at this meeting, and she probably will have plans for the rest of that money by the time the meeting is over. So we may.
I have already talked about this.
Well, subject to Jean Minio's aggressive financial demands on the town, I will say, I think it was last year, the warrant committee basically said, "Oh, the selectmen, you're stockpiling a budget because you didn't use things." And I fundamentally don't disagree with the philosophy of the warrant committee that says we had we originally allocated a $15,000 budget for purposes of giving the selectmen a degree of discretion to support things like the sorts of things that we do downtown. But I never thought it was our intention to build up an endowment. So if we're sitting at 20,000, if we know that we have major expenditures that are going to chew into that, that would be one thing for me. But if we actually are there in the interest, I don't know that we need to be at 35,000 by asking for 15,000.
Well, I mean, at least we know it'll bring Mike Pastore to town meeting. So we'd love to talk about that.
And I think
we'll come up with a plan. I'll talk to Jean tomorrow and we'll come up with a plan
Okay.
and I'll make a recommendation at our next meeting.
Maybe you should catch her right after this meeting, Christine, before she's had a night to think about it. Okay.
I gave her a heads up a few days ago. One of the other things, I think, Pete, you were going to talk about one of the articles.
Not sure which one you're talking about, Chris. Which one you want me to talk about?
You were
Happy
gonna
to talk.
You were going to talk about forming a committee.
Oh, yeah. Chris has suggested that we form a committee to study the name of the select board and whether it should be the Board of Selectmen or the Select Board.
Or something other than those two.
Or something
else.
other. Yeah. And so that I guess we're happy to form a committee to do that and to look into it. I think actually that we should look at the town seal, which has been around for 100 years, and whether or not it's appropriate for the next 100 years, or whether we should seek to make some changes for that too. So I'd probably throw that into that committee as well.
Well, Pete, if you do that, then I guess we need to talk about then we should talk about who's actually on that committee. I had pictured one thing for the specific issue of the Board of Selectmen's name, and I would picture a different thing if we're basically doing a comprehensive review of historic artifacts of the town. I just hadn't thought about that. It might be something we should talk over before we figure out which direction to go with that.
Sure. Let's have a discussion about that then. It's not something that's pressing if we're not going to do a name change this year.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
So I guess I take it then we're at least in agreement that the article's not going to be on this year's town meeting, that we'd go through it first and then.
Well, I think they're of our select board. I think there are two of us that don't want it to go forward this year, is my sense.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think you're nodding your head, Mike. So
Yeah,
okay,
no, I
that's-
think having a committee looking through it, kind of weighing the various options, getting the town historian involved, getting former members of the board involved, and doing the research, considering what the options are and how it would fit with the history of the town and the rest of it. I think that's the way to do it in a deliberate fashion to give people a chance to participate. And it's the kind of thing that I think should be done at a relatively ordinary and normal town meeting, which is not going to be the case for our town
this
meeting
year, yeah.
this year. We're still going to have to deal with a lot of important stuff this year, but I think it's going to be things that do have to be dealt with this year. And so if we can put that study together, get our town historian involved, and give people a chance to participate in the process and do it in a deliberate fashion and put it on a future town meeting warrant, I think that's the way to go with that particular issue.
Yep. Okay.
Hey,
So we'll have
Mark,
some
I
further-
have a question for Mark on this. In terms of who actually has the authority to change the name of the Board of Selectmen? Does it require town meeting vote or?
So it's actually bottom line, ultimately, it's a charter change, but it's a minor charter change. So there's several ways you can go about it. Basically, it comes to the same end result. So you could either, following the statute for a simple charter change, you would have a town meeting vote, which essentially is a recommendation to the voters, then goes on the next regular ballot, it passes, it's effective. Alternatively, you could do what many communities do, which is basically have the town meeting authorize the Board of Selectmen to file a home rule special legislation, and it goes to the legislature. The problem with that is, frankly, frequently I've seen with charter changes in the recent past that the legislature passes it subject to a local ballot question. So you go back and you end up with a vote anyway. So you might as well just, if that's what you're inclined to do town meeting followed by a ballot.
Okay.
Fair enough.
All right. Chris, anything else on the annual town meeting or warrant articles?
I had sent an email last night. There was a discussion at the warrant committee regarding pulling off of lot 1 on Ice House Road. And the warrant committee was just looking for clarification as to where the proceeds of that sale would go. As you know, per our financial policy, we state that it should be in reserves or stabilization account. I think they were just looking for clarification on exactly where that would be going.
So I mean, the candidates under the policy would be the stabilization fund or the OPEB trust fund. And I think we may tinker with the policies at some point this spring to expand the, as we've created additional stabilization funds. I think it'd be a good idea to look at which funds count as reserves when we're doing that calculation. And if we have the municipal building stabilization fund and the capital stabilization fund we're proposing to create, so we should look at that. I think if the warrant committee wants to include it, my view would be that it should just all go into general stabilization. I mean, it's a one-time asset sale, so it's not available for operations. It really shouldn't even be available for kind of regular capital spending. So I would say it would all go into stabilization.
That makes sense to me. And then once it's there, then we can always allocate it to another fund with taxpayer approval. But I don't think there was any question but that it was going to go into a reserve fund. And I don't have any problem with pre-committing to putting in the stabilization fund.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Sorrell.
So by statute, you're restricted to 5-year expenditure in a capitalization account. General Laws, Chapter 44, Section 63. Nick and I were reviewing that this afternoon.
Yeah, just to take a step back. So proceeds from a sale of land have to be turned into an investment of something that has an useful life of 5 years or greater. So it would be controlled by that state statute as well.
So is that arguing that we have to have an isolated stabilization fund for those funds in particular, Mark?
Not necessarily. Again, Nick and I were talking about it, like the building stabilization fund. You just have to be aware when you put it into that fund, what you then appropriate it for.
So,
right. So this would mean that you would have to trace. So we sell the land.
Yeah.
And then we'd have to spend it within 5 years.
No, you cannot spend it except for something that's essentially a capital investment. Either another piece of land or some piece of vehicle equipment that has a value, has a useful life 5 years or greater.
We can't just put it into our reserve account as town reserves.
Spend it.
You can pocket any way you want. It's just when you go to spend it, you're restricted by the statute.
Okay.
Okay.
So that let's think that one through. So first off, that sounds like you would not put it in the not that I'm advocating for this anyway, but you would not put it in the OPEB trust fund because that's a long-term financial obligation, but not a capital asset. You might want to put it in the capital stabilization fund because that's where it would ultimately have to go. Well, yeah, that's not where it would ultimately have to go if you were going to spend it to something that was capital.
Those are all 5-year longer
I
items.
think so.
Right. I'm looking for administrative simplicity here. You could always put in the stabilization fund.
Even
And
even the new one that was suggested, I think, would probably be a minimum of 5-year useful life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and we can play games with what particular dollars come out of a stabilization fund. You know, whenever we put something into one of those other funds, we could say, well, those are the dollars, they just went there. But it might be easier just to park it there at the start. But then we have overrides. So you would park it, that would accelerate.
Well, we've got at least one specialized stabilization right now that has its own definitions and all, and this would comply fully. And the second one that you're proposing to set up at some point would fall into the same category, which you would only have a problem if you just dumped it into the general stabilization fund, which doesn't have that general restriction.
Yeah, but here's the other problem, Mark. If you let's say we get paid $5 million for some capital asset we sold off. If you put it into that capital building stabilization fund, which was funded through an override that has that kind of downward ratchet to it, you throw that extra $5 million in there. That's good. You're building up the balance in the capital fund, but you're still going to have to keep putting the $1 million or whatever that's the override funding, or you have to make the decision you're deliberately going to ratchet that number down, which we could do, I guess, because you put this extra charge of money in there. I'm just trying to think through the implications of an override funded stabilization fund.
So, to the chair, first of all, it's an independent capitalization fund. It just so happens that we, up till now, determined to fund it to an override. Frankly, given the nature of that, if you take the longest view, that's money that's available for some potentially huge expenditures in the maintenance and upkeep of your buildings and physical plants. So it's almost like, to my way of thinking, you can't possibly put too much money aside for that purpose.
Well, so the argument I made when we set the $1 million up was, pick a number that will allow us to fund our capital needs at that level, for the foreseeable future, with the idea that, all right, you're going to commit to this override, but this is the amount that's going in every year, and then we're going to manage this fund to cover our capital asset requirements. Just throwing an extra X amount in there kind of breaks with that commitment, unless we dropped, if we sat there and said, well, instead of $1 million a year, we're going to drop to $750,000 a year because we just accelerated by throwing X millions of dollars in here, then that would be fine. It's just that throwing money in there does kind of matter if you're also having the taxpayers make an annual contribution, when the fund itself was set up saying we set that override amount at what it takes to sustain this fund.
Well, if you drop the amount, then you can't get it back up all low.
That's what I'm saying.
Right. Well, you can get it up at the 2.5 per year, even if you drop it in 1 year. But I mean, I think that first of all, when we picked that number, we didn't pick a number that was too high. So if you played it out over the course of the 20 years and what's in the capital plan, that didn't fully fund the capital plan, right? We thought it would fund enough of it. And the expectation was we would continue to seek other sources of revenue. There'd be grants and that sort of thing. There'd be the potential for borrowing in that. We've got to redo that plan. I mean, probably once the situation with the new elementary school is resolved, kind of to redo it, to clear out whatever's going to be cleared out, and then kind of figure out where we are. But I think what it would let you do, for example, and again, I don't think we're going to get $20 million for selling lot one. So we're going to be talking about a decent chunk of money, but not a, not a windfall, is that it would let you cover other expenses out of it, right? Because we got confirmation from the DOR that we can use the funds from that stabilization fund to pay debt service, for example, And so if you had a situation where maybe you'd be bonding a $6 million project, you would do a $4 million bond and pay the debt service on $2 million out of the fund, right? If we thought the fund was adequately, funded to kind of reduce what the burden on the taxpayers would be at that time. So if we have this restriction and we've got to put the money from the land sales, we can't just put it in the bank as a general reserve because it's got to come out to be paid for. Now, again, you can, I don't want to say play games, but since cash is fungible, if we got caught short in a given year, because the purpose of the stabilization fund is if we get caught short for a year or two to kind of backstop the local revenue, if you got caught short in that year, as long as some of the shortage is caused by something that lasts more than 5 years, you could use the stabilization fund money to plug that hole and then move the money in to plug the other hole. And so you'd have to get the accounting correct. But I think it's just as easy if and again, particularly if we tweak our policies, as I think we ought to take kind of the post town meeting balances and our other stabilization counts and count those as reserves, because they are reserves against future obligations of the town. Then I think I could see, and we'll have to get the details on this too, putting it into capital stabilization or putting it into municipal stabilization, or a little of both, depending on what the number is. And then we'll have to deal with that same issue. It's not a town meeting issue with the sale of the Hinckley South property. And it sounds like it'd be possible. I was going to propose when this discussion came up that we at least think about, depending on what the final number is, allocating some amount of that money towards the Affordable Housing Trust, and avoid using the bond at all in the near term, because it is an affordable housing development that's going to be proposed for that. Now, it may be that given what the trust spends its money on, we have to work out whether, anyway, we'll work out the details of this restriction, but that may not be possible. But I think that the proceeds from that sale would go to the same place. So interesting.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So the other potential recipient, which has been mentioned, but just so that it's there for some thought, ironically, because you're talking about disposing of property, but also land acquisition is, you can easily expend the money for that. So I don't know whether, what may come available in the future that you would want to have funds available for that purpose.
We wouldn't be able to do that out of the capital stabilization fund, I don't think, though, right?
Right.
No, because it's tied into building.
Right.
But I mean, conceivably, you could still put it in general stabilization. And if there's no requirement to spend it, you would just have a restriction on this percentage of the general stabilization. And then maybe in the future, you would do a swap out, frankly. If you had some land purchase you wanted to do, you'd transfer the $1 million from stabilization and put $1 million back in that wouldn't have the restrictions on it. And that would satisfy whatever the public policy objective of the statute was.
So as Christine, to the question that came up, I don't think there's any doubt, but that we want to put the money into reserves. We're not going to use it for operating expenses or anything like that. For purposes of this one specific sale, it sounds like we should basically work to identify where we would put the proceeds of at least this particular sale that we're looking for authorization, where we're planning to put it. I'm okay with putting it in the capital stabilization fund. Given your explanation there, Mike, I'm okay with committing that we're going to do that, if that makes sense to you and Pete.
It does to me, but maybe we should talk about what the numbers would be as well. Maybe up to a certain amount it would go there, over a certain amount it would go someplace else, and depending on what we need it for. So
once we discover there's oil on the property before we sell it.
Right. If you like municipal accounting, this really is the meeting to come to.
I don't think this is going to be our most downloaded meeting.
We're just getting warmed up.
So hopefully that's enough to satisfy the warrant committee.
I do see a note from Sharon Tatro. We just would like to know if it's reserves or operating, I think. So I think a commitment to reserves is what we needed to vote with, if I remember right. So if that's it, there's no doubt that's where we want to put it.
Yeah, so the last 15 minutes, we didn't need to discuss
Yeah, I
that.
should have been paying attention to the questions and answers.
Action items, Maurice Goulet, DPW Director, requests that the Board of Selectmen sign the Chapter 90 final report for the intersection study by Niche Engineering. Around 10,000, I think it was.
Yes, this is just a reimbursement through Chapter 90. 10,300.
All right, well, I would move then that we sign the Chapter 90 final report for the intersection study by Niche Engineering as requested by Maurice Goulet.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
Fire Chief William Carrico requests that the Board of Selectmen approve a contract amendment with Comstar LLC, who seems to do our billing, is it?
Yes, and this change would allow comstar to, if Medfield Fire responds to somebody who does not have insurance and it's COVID related, the federal government will pay for those costs. This will allow comstar to recoup those costs.
Any questions? Or do we have a motion?
I would move that we approve the contract amendment with Comstar as requested by the fire chief.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
Nancy Tella, Medfield Garden Club, requests permission to plant a tree at Meeting House Pond, shown by little red squigglies on her plans or pictures.
I appreciated the multiple photos and maps and everything of,
I like them too. I want to
the
know how to
site.
do red squigglies on my pictures too.
yeah.
And I would note in the write-up that the cost for the tree and the installation are being covered by Najwa Sabra's husband, and just want to pass out a thank you for doing that.
Any questions or comments about this, or do we have a motion?
I would move that we approve the request from the Medfield Garden Club to plant the tree in the location requested at Meeting House Pond.
Can I hold you for one moment? We have a comment. Somebody would like to speak to this.
Oh,
Hey, Russ, you can speak.
Hi there, Russ Hallisey again. I don't know where she's looking to plant a tree at Meeting House Pond. Can you either put up the picture or describe where it is? My concern is issues with Medfield Day.
The other picture.
I would say that there are booths that run along the pond, and this would be probably inside those booths on the away from the pond from the booths.
So so you're saying the main grassy area where we have booths that back up against the pond,
Mm-hmm.
it's between there and the pond?
No, it's directly across from the Dwight Derby House front door.
There was one aerial shot on an assessor's map that might, if you can get that up, I don't know, Nick, if you can get it up, might be helpful.
it looks to me and that it's in line with other trees. Like it's not going to be out front of, it's not going to stick out like a, like a promontory in front of the other trees. There's other trees that look to me to be in the same level of depth. Like,
So it's between Frary Street and the pond?
No, it's on the other side, Russ.
it's on the other side.
Yeah, so it's what I was saying, the grassy area. So you know where the food court is?
Yeah, no, I
And
got you.
opposite the food court is a row of booths
Yep,
that back up to the pond.
yep.
You're saying it's between those booths
And the
and
food
the
court.
pond?
No,
And
it's
the- and the
between,
If
No.
you, Nick, if you want me to share, I've got one of the pictures up on my screen if you
I'm
want
just
me to.
not finding the right one on hand. Sorry about that.
I mean, it looks like it would be between the booths and the pond,
That's what I was guessing.
like behind, because there's other trees that are in the same, unless you have other booths that are behind trees. I mean, it looks like it's in line with existing trees.
Yeah, right. So that's where I was picturing. And there's a row of trees along there, which is away from the pond. And we typically put our booths in between those trees. in a line there.
You'd have another tree in which to put it between, I think.
And that's problems for us. They did I love them dearly, but a year ago, they put a bench up in between a couple of trees and basically took away our booth space where they put that park bench. It sounds like they want to put another tree in the row of trees, which will probably interfere with our booth lineup again.
Oh, look at that nice blue picnic table out there.
Mhm.
Excellent
Yeah.
placement.
Yeah. So part
So,
of me
Chris,
says, I wonder why we even need another tree in
Chris,
this area.
does the garden club have a time on this? Or can they, can we ask them to go and talk with the memo about the placement and come back to us?
I'm sure they'd be more than happy to talk about the placement. Yep. I can
Okay.
talk to Nancy
Why don't we
Kelly.
do that then?
Okay, great. You can give them my contact information.
Very
I'll
good.
let you know, we tried to reach out to Nancy during the day today and left voicemails, so we weren't able to contact her beforehand. And I just learned about this when I saw the agenda in preparation for the new life matter. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk with her about it.
Okay. So we'll put that over to our next meeting. Then our next item is a vote to postpone annual
Thank-
town meeting
Thank you.
from
Thank you,
May
Russ.
3, 2021 to a new date, Monday, May 17, 2021, or Tuesday, May 18, 2021.
So I move that and do we have to set a time as well, or is the time going to be up for grabs, Christine?
I think Scott would like to go at 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock?
5 o'clock,
Both days?
both days.
Okay.
So I would move that we postpone the annual town meeting from May 3rd, 2021 to a new date of Monday, May 17th, 2021 and Tuesday, May 18th, 2021 at 5 p.m.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
aye.
and Mr. Marcucci, aye.
Next item is Cliff Monak requests that the Board of Selectmen sign a private way covenant for Lincoln Court.
They are actually here to speak about that. Hold on.
Okay, great.
Hello there.
Hello.
Hi, Susan. Nice picture. Those must be your kids.
She's muted.
We can't hear you, Susan, if you're speaking.
Muted on the screen. There you go.
No talk.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
Evening.
It looks, we're trying to get onto video also.
Shoot.
Little button lower left on my.
Yeah, but then I just,
Launch meeting.
no, oh, no.
Mr. Chairman, while they're working with that, let me just indicate that this is a form that I requested to implement the ZBA decision. So it is a form that I've generated between Medfield originally, and then Franklin has been refined and brought it back to use here to maximize the protection to the town as far as not being obligated to maintain the road or drainage or other infrastructure there, but also to give us the right, should the homeowners not be doing what they're supposed to do, there's a homeowners association being set up. If we needed to, we do have the right, not the obligation, to go in and do whatever needs to be done and then to charge the homeowners. So that's all part of a covenant with the developer owners, which we go to record at the registry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sorrell. Mr. Monak, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Oh, good evening. Thank you for having us. As Attorney Sorrell pointed out, we have submitted the covenant to the town. Also, there's a homeowners association that takes care of certain rights and responsibilities and obligations of the people when they, the ultimate unit owners, when they come in to take care of those items that were laid out in the zoning board's decision. And Mark was good enough to expeditiously handle the covenant itself and the homeowners association. And we think that it meets the town's requirements, and we'd respectfully ask that the Board of Selectmen vote in favor of this.
Okay, Gus, do you have any questions?
I do have one question, and I'm not even sure who to direct this at. Item 5 on this covenant basically refers to the point that the owners take responsibility for maintaining basically maintaining everything on the property. One of the things it talks about is the evergreen buffer along Grove Street. And my only question is, and it says, if there's any failure, the town can come in and fix things. But when I was looking at that, I was saying, is there a standard of performance for that? Because it seemed to me that's a pretty subjective thing, whether there's enough, whether they're healthy enough, whether it's thick enough. And I'm not suggesting either that, Mr. Monak, that you wouldn't keep it up. I'm saying I don't know what the standard is that either party of this would be evaluating against as this is written. And I just wondered.
Mr. Chairman, I think I
Yes,
can
please.
address that. Because
Please.
I inserted this language, so it's basically for a worst case scenario. So the last thing we want to do when it's a private road is have to go in and do work. So we're not going to be looking to do it, but if, for instance, worst case scenario, this whole line of trees winter killed or blighted or what have you, and you couldn't get the owners association, which is being set up to replace them, the town could, under that scenario, go in and make a replacement. Now, this buffer is particularly critical, and Cliff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was being put in to address concerns from residents on Grove Street.
Correct.
And very sensitive that be maintained. So we needed that as an extra tool. But we have one other analogous situation up next to St. Edwards, that private road that goes back to where Drew Bledsoe and the others lived, and Kurt Schilling, and that had a similar type of road covenant put in place, and we've never exercised rights under that. But this is kind of a belt and suspenders because there is a owners association. There are private restrictive covenants, but I wanted to have a mechanism that the town itself would be fully protected, as would its abutting residents. And that's why I really insisted on this particular form being executed.
So what was behind my question, and I haven't talked to anybody in Grove, I don't even know that I know anybody on Grove Street. But I was trying to picture someone on Grove Street looking out their window and deciding that the buffer isn't complete enough and complaining to the town that the buffer is inadequate, and then saying, how do you even, who adjudicates whether the buffer is good enough, whether the owners need to do more? It felt like the town could be right in the middle of trying to adjudicate that kind of a disagreement as this is written. We just use our judgment. I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Through the chair, I mean, there's a certain element of common sense and practicality to this. Mm-hmm. There's also a 30-day notice provision that if we receive complaints, and we would forward them on to the homeowners association, and there'd be some kind of a dialogue. This is really just a worst case scenario.
Okay.
Because as it is, we would have to upfront the money and then go chasing the owners association to get reimbursed. So again, it's not something we're going to do except in an extreme case.
Okay. All right. That was the only question I had.
Mike, anything on it?
No.
My question then, Mark, would be if we do have to do some self-help for the town, can we then just put that as a lien, like the property taxes, or do we have to actually sue to?
It depends what it is. Generally speaking, you can only lien something when the statutory authority for it, and utility type stuff, water and sewer, those types of things. There are statutory authority for
Not
lien.
here then. Okay.
Probably not for this.
Yep. Okay. So do we have a motion then for this?
Yes, I would move to authorize us to sign the covenant with the town of Medfield for Lincoln Court, a private way.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
Mr. Chairman, it
Yes,
does
Mr.
need to
Sorrell.
be, it does need to be executed and notarized, and I believe that it's somewhat time sensitive, so I don't
Okay.
know.
It's set up for all of us to
All
sign
three of us, yeah, all three of us.
and all three of us to notarize. Yikes. Okay, we'll figure that out.
I think Evelyn is a notary, right?
Yeah, Evelyn.
Yes,
Yeah.
he usually
Evelyn.
does it.
Evelyn is
Mary-
not free, but Marion will be here.
Marion's the
Very
notary
nice,
now.
yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Monak, you need it soon, do you?
As soon as you possibly could work it out, that would be great.
Okay. Does that mean you have a sale pending?
I do in fact have a sale pending.
Excellent. Good for you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming. I'm sure the town hall will let you know when it's been signed and notarized.
Sarah will probably reach out to you and let you know. We should get it done by the end of the week.
Very good. Thank you for your time.
I can come by
Absolutely.
tomorrow.
Ooh, I got distracted by the Monak computer. Next item is the David Maxim requests $5,000 for the town clock repairs. This, I guess, is both the clock at the Unitarian Church and the one up at the State Hospital too. Should say town clocks then.
Did it cover both of them?
I think it had something to do with the one up at the State Hospital too, getting pieces to make the that one work.
Mentioned it. I know we mentioned it, but let me see.
Yeah, it's toward the end of his email.
Yeah, okay. No, it is for both of them. Okay. Yep.
Sorrow in the chat would like to know if there was anything in the chapel lease that we have that would complicate Dave maintaining or doing any work on that clock.
Do we need Gene Minio's permission, in other words? Man, another town clock has gotten out of the town property.
I bet you should be happy to have us fix her clock.
More importantly, is it Cam that needs to pay for the repair to the chapel clock?
To be perfectly honest, I can say I was totally unaware of there even being a clock when I drafted the lease, so frankly, I don't think it addresses it.
So my only so I agreed with the request. The only question I had is where does that money actually come from?
I will find it.
In this fiscal, to his point about possibly spreading across fiscal years, you're going to find it in FY21 funds.
I'm going to try and find it in fiscal year 21. It sounds like an emergency clock repair, and it might be for a reserve fund transfer.
Does sound quite urgent.
It sounds very urgent. Yep.
Either that, or I can redo that spreadsheet that I just went through to take 5K back. But
all right, so I would move that we, subject to finding available funds, to appropriate $5,000 to pursue the renovation and rehabilitation of the clock, the town clock, and the clock at the Lee Chapel.
Second.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
Aye.
and Mr. Marcucci, aye.
And the emergency is the knob and tube wiring that's going to get replaced. Our next item is a vote to authorize the chair of the Board of Selectmen to sign the amendment to the feasibility study agreement with the Mass School Building Authority.
I don't have any questions. That was basically a date change.
Yeah. And they had already authorized this extension, so this is just formalizing.
It's just the paperwork.
Yeah, so I would move that we authorize Chairman Peterson to sign, or as he is known in this letter, Mr. Osler, to authorize Chairman Peterson to sign the First Amendment to the feasibility study agreement between the town of Medfield and the MSBA.
Second.
Mr. Peterson,
Mr. Osler.
Mr. Murby, Mr. Gustav. And Mr. Mike says yes.
Okay.
Just so everybody knows, the Board of Selectmen started on Zoom at just about 5:30, so we're reaching our limit a little earlier than normal.
I thought she was going to say we started last April and our meetings are only getting better and better.
That too.
Yeah, we are 3 hours in now. So I was so impressed that I actually got to connect to the 3 Zooms that we needed to connect to get to here. Our next item is Liz Sandeman requests display of the Donate Life flag at the Townhouse lobby for April for Organ Donation Awareness Month.
I move that we approve this request.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
And then our next item is under consent agenda.
There's 2 items under consent agenda.
Jean Minier requests permission to post signs in usual locations for Porch Fest, and the Norfolk Hunt Club requests use of the Medfield State Hospital on the following dates: Saturday, May 1, 2021 at 9 a.m., Saturday, May 15, 2021 at 9 a.m., Tuesday, September 7, 2021 at 8 a.m., Saturday, October 2nd, 2021 at 9 a.m., Thursday, Thanksgiving, November 25, 2021 at 9 a.m.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
Chris, are at least those first 2 dates affected by, as the other events were in terms of COVID?
I don't.
Potentially.
think Hunt Club, I'll work with Gil on this, but I think they're fine for their riding activities.
So it's a ride through or something like
It's
that?
yeah, it's their annual ride. They do these every year, and Gil is always very good about sending me his insurance certificates ahead of time. So we don't do a full license agreement, but he does name us as an additional insured.
Okay.
Yep. Bill is also commenting that it may restrict their access if they're doing work on the laundry parcel, but I will work with Gil on that as well.
All right, so I would move, the only question I have is with respect to Jean Minio's request. I'm assuming it's going to be for the 3 weeks leading up to Porch Fest. So is Porch Fest May 1st?
May 1st.
All right, so,
Why don't we just have a policy that whenever we give the sign request, that it's for the 3 weeks?
yeah. So I will move, we approve the items in the consent agenda to note that the signs to be posted for Porch Fest run from April 11th through May 1st, or April 10th through May 1st, the 3 weeks leading up to May 1st, and the Hunt Club as well.
Second,
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.
I don't think we've had consent agendas for a while.
Yeah,
Town administrator update. Go ahead.
nice to have them back. You forgot, I was going to say citizen comment, Pete, but we have citizens commenting, but they're not appearing live, so.
They're holding their comments or private comments, huh?
They're written comments. We're getting written comments only from citizens.
Town administrator updates.
The only update I have for you this evening is based on the date change for town meeting, we are now going to hold the annual warrant hearing on Thursday, April 1st, 2021.
And I think because that won't be during one of our meetings, we won't have to be there for it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That'll just be a warrant committee on Zoom.
Mhm. Correct.
Okay, and Chris has put our next meeting dates, March 16, 23, and 30. Selectmen reports. Gus?
I think I have anything to report. It's these weekly meetings. There's just not enough going on in Medfield for me to get in any mischief. I guess the one thing I would mention, based on the email we all got about the activities up at the state hospital, is I'll be reaching out to John Thompson. I did take a tour of the hospital site over the weekend just to look at the signage we have around the leash notifications, and I'll be looking to track John down to share some thoughts on that.
And that was about a dog getting its ear bitten off by another dog, and they.
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple things. Number one, there were 2 things that are supposed to happen. One, which is that people inside the quad are supposed to have their dogs on leashes.
Yeah.
But part of the issue is making sure the signs are clear what people need to do. There are some confusing signs up there that it would be actually a little hard for someone who intended to abide by the rules to probably understand what those rules are. So that's what I want to talk over with John. I think we all got an email from Jenny Cronin that basically said, yeah, there have been some incidents. It happened to be that particular incident involved 2 dog owners from Millis And so they've basically gotten a letter of disinvite from our town, telling to keep off our property and keep their dogs out of our town. But her general comment was that the patrol she does up there, people are very, by and large, the dog owners are doing, conducting themselves in a good way. So there are incidents, but in the grand scheme of things, those are exceptions, not the rule.
Yeah, there's a lot of poop on the ground up there, unfortunately, that people they're not carrying out what their dogs carry in. Anything further, Gus?
That's it.
Mike?
Hopefully they will clear that up before the New Life road race up there, or it could be an unpleasant
Oh, yeah.
unpleasant run for a lot of people. The only update I have of note is the Affordable Housing Trust met last Thursday to review the 4 proposals that we received for the senior development at Hinckley South. And the trust has narrowed it to 2 of those 4 proposals and will be interviewing those developers Thursday night at our next meeting. And I think the hope is that then, I don't know if it'll be a recommendation of a rank order recommendation, just a recommendation of one, to make a recommendation to us to review coming out of that meeting Thursday night. Conceivably, I think it could be on our agenda for next week, depending on the outcome of that discussion. But both developers will be in to answer some questions in that meeting, which will be a regular, open meeting Thursday night. I think that's
Okay.
all I have.
All right, thank you. I just mentioned that I was at the Medfield Foundation meeting last night. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was Megan Sullivan suggested to me that it would be helpful for the select board to have a discussion about what we think might happen to Dale Street, the site where the school is now, if we actually move to the school to the Wheelock site. So maybe in one of our upcoming meetings, we can have a little bit of discussion about that. Informational items, request for appointment to the Tri-County Regional Vocational Technical School Committee. David Bento, is he the David Bento who's the chief of police in Sherburne now?
He is.
And so we need to replace him. He's resigning from the.
Yeah. So I reached out to Scott and to Jeff, and they're going to solicit for somebody who's interested in serving. And we'll bring that back for a joint meeting to have an appointment.
Okay.
It's just in reading the letter, if I'm reading it right, it's only Pete that has to worry about it.
We don't even need a full team then.
I'm happy to share the responsibility with you guys.
Unless Pete were to procrastinate long enough to have it be Mike.
I believe the tri-county appointments in the towns are three people: the chair of the selectmen, the
Chair.
The moderator and the chair of the school committee.
Right.
Yep. So no flies on us. It's kind of like.
Right. Right. So it's either up to Pete or he's got a filibuster for 3 weeks.
Right. There you go.
All right. It sounds like it's time for a motion to adjourn.
It is.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Murby,
Yes.
and Mr. Marcucci, yes.